data on costs and things is continuously being updated. And we actually, although we put together a paper that we have out on our website, that was in November, since then we have gotten some additional cost information. So what is being shared with you today, it has some updated numbers and some updated insights from our paper that we have on our website. We will eventually be updating what is on our website. We also, in addition to the major study on our website, have a 3-page brief, which is available on our website that has been updated with all of this latest information. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Josh. Josh has about 45 minutes of presentation, and what we want to do is leave the last 15 minutes, 12:45 on at the end for Q&A. So over to you,
Great.
Josh.
Awesome. All right, let's get started. Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, we're going to be looking at California's route to carbon neutrality today and in this study. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention a few people on the team, myself, and then Lynn Orr is here as well, was the PI on this project. Sarah had a crucial role as well as the project manager. And then there are a number of other professors at Stanford that were involved and advised, as well as also a master's student who's no longer at Stanford. He's now in industry. Andrew Burson was very integral in these studies, and also another PhD student, Anela. So all this work couldn't be possible without the folks I'm showing on the screen, and also some other people that aren't even shown. So as Sarah mentioned, this was a several-year project, and there's sort of 4 phases. We're in the last phase now. Just to walk you through these phases and what we've been doing the last few years. In phase 1, it really started with interviewing folks across industry in all different types of industrial sectors, from people who make boilers to folks in the building sector, industry sector, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And we really wanted to hear about what the challenge of carbon neutrality means to them and what they think about the transition. So then we took many of those qualitative insights and use them in more quantitative studies, and our topical deep dives, which Sarah mentioned, are on our website with the link shown here. And these were basically quantitative looks at where the emission sources are today, as well as what are the possible solutions across 8 industrial sectors in California: electricity, transport, industry, commercial, residential, and then as well as 3 sort of alternative fuel or alternative methods of reductions in hydrogen, bioenergy, and forest management. Then in phase 3, which I did most of my work on, we basically integrated the insights from phase 1 and phase 2 into one coherent model, which we call DECAL. And DECAL was built using a commercial software called LEAP. And we sort of integrated all the data into one place. So I'll show you some of those insights today. And then the 4th phase is what we're doing now, is we want to publicize this information so that it can really make an impact. So today we'll talk first a bit about motivation and background. Then I'm going to show some experiments or analyses across 8 different sectors. First, economy-wide, then the electricity sector, transport and industry, F-gases or refrigerants, the building sector, renewable diesel, and direct air capture. I'm not showing everything today, but just some of the stuff we thought was most interesting and pertinent. And then we'll conclude and talk about future work. So just to motivate us, here I'm showing California's emissions historically by sector, as well as our interim 2030 goal and our 2045 carbon neutrality goal, just to sort of show just how difficult this is going to be. You can see that we have been making progress in the last 20 years, but the slope in which we need to change to get to our carbon neutrality goal really does need to pick up if we're going to get there. Most progress today has been in the electricity sector as well. We can see that a bit, this top bar here. So we're really going to need progress in all these other sectors as well if we're going to meet our target. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, is how is this going to be possible? What's it going to take? What technologies do we need? What policies do we need? What's it going to cost? These types of things. So before we get into that, I'll talk a bit about the model that we developed. And actually, before that, let's talk about the model that sort of we compared ourselves to, the CARB scoping plan. So the scoping plan is a document put out by CARB every 5 years, which sort of shows their plan, their pathway, their answer to the question of what's it going to take for whatever carbon goal they have at the time, which now recently is carbon neutrality by 2045. It's the state's most aggressive goal yet, or most ambitious goal. And so as part of this study, CARB put out a reference case. This is their business as usual forecast, and also a proposed scenario. This is sort of their best bet of how we can get to 2045 carbon neutrality. And those emission profiles are shown here on the right in the dashed lines. So when we were developing our model, which I'll tell you a bit about, we used the scoping plan as a way to sort of sense check ourselves and make sure that we're able to produce reasonable emissions projections. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the model that we built. So it's called DECAL, standing for Decarbonize California. As I mentioned earlier, it was built using LEAP, which is a commercial software used by countries globally and municipalities for energy assessment and emissions assessment. There's 3 results that come out of DECAL that we care about the most, sort of emission savings, costs, and resources, or how much fuel are we going to use, how much do we need to import or export, et cetera. The model system boundary is California. It includes scope 1 and 2 emissions. So just very briefly, scope 1 is things that happen in-house or at the site. So you can imagine natural gas being burned at a building. That's scope 1. Scope 2 would be emissions from electricity, from the electricity that you're using in your building. That emissions happens offsite at a plant. And then scope 3 is not included. Those includes things like the emissions to make the materials that are used in the building, for example, like the desks and the chairs. So that's actually not in scope of the model. The economics are from the perspective of the state. So the technical term for this is that we are performing a total resource cost test. Essentially what that means is that we're tracking cash flow into and out of the state. And this is important to remember when we're showing a cost metric, that the total resource cost test can give you a different answer, or the economics from the perspective of the state can give you a different answer than if you did the economics from the perspective of an end user, for example. So how economic, for example, heavy duty battery electric vehicles are from the perspective of the state might be different than the economics from the perspective of the person that would actually be using the battery electric vehicle. So really DECAL should be used as a first pass of economics, and then more detailed economics can be done from the perspective of the user. In terms of the methods that we're using, we use stock and flow in the buildings and transport sectors. So this is an advanced modeling method that allows us to capture lag effects in the economy for natural turnover. We are using optimization in the electricity sector. And then outside of the optimization electricity sector, the model is mostly driven by exogenously defined levers. So what that means is we basically tell the model what to do, and then it projects the future given those decisions. It's not a model that tells us what to do. Maybe you'd see that in like an equilibrium model or a economy-wide optimization model. So back to this plot on the right, we just wanted to sense check ourselves to see that we actually can make reasonable projections. So what we did here is we parsed through CARB's scoping plan documents, both the reference case and proposed scenario, and tried to put what they did into our lever language. And just to say again what a lever is, these are like buttons at the top of the model that drive where the model goes and what it does. So we put that into our lever language, and what we saw is pretty reasonable results. We do tend to sit above CARB for most of the modeling period. We can kind of get into more reasons why we might be slightly different than CARB. We've done some analysis there in the backup slides, but for the most part, given the number of variables at play, we were actually fairly happy with the alignment. Okay, I'm gonna try to guess through this slide so we can talk about the fun stuff. Really quickly, there are 3 types of emission sources in decal that I wanted to make you aware of. That can kind of help us think about what's going on. So one is bottom up. These are emission sources that are mitigated in a bottom up way. So you can think of like at the heat pump level or at the level of a battery electric vehicle. Here we have a very detailed understanding of how many things are in the stock, how much they cost. The economics are done in a bottom up way, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a group of emissions which we call top down. These are more so emission sources that we know exist, but we don't have a very detailed handling of the modeling, or maybe not as detailed. And then finally, there's a group of emissions that we are not touching, at least in these experiments that I'm going to show. And that's mainly because, to the best of our knowledge, CARB doesn't touch these either. And these are very dispersed, typically very dispersed emission sources, typically non-energy sources that are very difficult to decarbonize, that we don't have great solutions for. So we can see the majority of emissions are modeled in a bottom-up way, a smaller portion top-down, and then we have these 18 that are not levered. And in practicality, if we want to get to zero, this 18 million tons that are not touched just means that at minimum, we'll need 18 million tons of some sort of carbon dioxide removal, such as DAC, to get to zero by 2045. So that's sort of baked into this analysis as a minimum. Okay, so we're through the intro for the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to step you through a series of experiments that we did that can help uncover some insights that we think were interesting. So I'll try to start each experiment by telling you what the insight is and what the graph means and what you're seeing, and then I'll kind of step you through it. So here, the point, which we're showing here in the subtitles, is that a few policies and programs are key. So there's a few technologies that are really driving the majority of the impact. And as a second point, that said, we still do need research and development and scaling if we want to reach our goal. Okay, so how do we come up with that conclusion? On the slide here, what I'm showing is 17 different policies or programs or technologies that were used in the decal version CARB proposed scenario. So just to back up a second, we're looking at this blue solid line, our version of the CARB scoping plan scenario. And what we're doing in the analysis that I was showing is we're reverting groups of levers by technology or policy, one at a time from their settings in the blue line to their settings in the orange line, in the solid orange line. So what that does, and then what we're looking at is how much emissions essentially those levers were responsible for abating in 2045 at the end year of the model. So what this is basically showing is a sensitivity analysis of how much emissions each technology or policy is responsible for in the decal version CARB proposed scenario, sorted from most impact to least impact. We're also using a color coding that we think is helpful. So the blue technologies here, we're calling available at scale. These are things that are kind of already proliferated throughout the economy. So for example, battery electric vehicles, we see those throughout the economy, solar and wind, et cetera, et cetera. And then pilot scale, these are things that have been demonstrated at large scales, but are not quite yet proliferated throughout the economy. So you can think of like heavy duty vehicles or clean heavy duty vehicles, and CCS are good examples. And then there are some things that are still sort of at the research and development phase, but for the most part, and this most pertinently includes things like direct air capture and clean refrigerants. So there's not like a hugely you basically, you can disagree with these groupings if you'd like to. This was just our best bet of where we would put things just to help us think about things. And sort of what the takeaway of the plot is, first of all, is that we can get 80% of the way to our target, or 80% of the emissions abatement is achieved with 8 key areas. And these 8 shown on the left side here, just to say what those are out loud, because they're really important to reach our goal. First of all, direct air capture, which you can see CARB was highly reliant on direct air capture to get to their target. This number here, 66, is pretty much exactly consistent with the CARB scoping plan. So then we have decarbonizing light-duty vehicles, decarbonizing heavy-duty vehicles, cleaning our electric grid, fuel switching industry, decarbonizing refrigerants, decarbonizing the residential sector, and then industrial CCS. So these 8 policies really are the biggest drivers and where we should be focusing our attention. Also interesting in the plot is that if we just sum the blue bars, the green bars, and by the way, I am colorblind, so if I mess up a color, forgive me. But I think these are the red bars or maroon bars. If we just sum those up, we see we get 40% of the way there with technologies that are already available, which is in some way good news. But still, we still need 60% of the technologies that are either at pilot scale or R&D scale. So we will really need to focus. We can't just settle with what we have. We need to develop. We need to research still. We need to scale technologies that have been proven at pilot scale if we want to reach our goal. Okay. So this next plot is actually the same analysis, same experiment, same set of scenarios, essentially. But I'm just showing something slightly different. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing cumulative mitigated emissions. So this is not in 2045 anymore. This is over the entire modeling period. And so the width of these blocks is proportional to the cumulative mitigated emissions for these scenarios. The y-axis here is the cost of abatement, a common metric in units of dollars per ton. And in totality, this plot is called a MAC plot, marginal abatement cost curve, which is a pretty common plot for these types of studies. And so it's the same groups of scenarios, and we can see our 8 key scenarios are shown with stars here. So what's interesting is you can kind of see about half of those 8 key areas are sort of towards the left of the plot and are somewhat low cost, and the other half are somewhat high cost. We also, so that kind of tells us that, we can get quite far with policies that are affordable, but we also are going to need to spend some money to get to zero. It's not going to necessarily be only cheap solutions. We also can see that the coloring kind of makes a bit of sense here, where mostly on the left we have blue, which are technologies that are already available at scale, and mostly on the right we have ones that are this red color. In the R&D phase, those tend to be more expensive. And interestingly, the pilot scale ones, it can be kind of throughout the map. For example, for heavy duty vehicles, it's on the cheaper side. Because NREL actually projects cost parity for for hydrogen and electric vehicles with fossil fuel vehicles sort of over this modeling period in the next 20 years. So that's why it ends up being negative cost of abatement. Also, CCS is fairly cheap because of incentives like 45Q and LCFS. But you can also get like fuel switching options in agriculture and industry that are more expensive, and also electrolysis, for example. The takeaway from overall is that there are some programs that are affordable, some less so. We have to be aware of that. Also maybe drive our attention to reducing costs in these areas. I also did want to mention that there's a lot of uncertainty with cost. So I would not take away from this plot just the outright number. Like I wouldn't say we have a high degree of confidence that decarbonizing light duty vehicles is going to cost exactly negative $250 per ton. But we do feel relatively good about the relative ordering of these bars and sort of what is on the cheaper side and what is on the more expensive side. So that, I think, is more so the takeaway. Okay, I'm going to go to the next series of analyses. Just give me just 1 second to take a break. So we're going to step out of the economy-wide analysis and go into the electricity sector. So here, actually, I'm showing a few different experiments. The point of this slide is to show you that we have to be very proficient at building electricity infrastructure if we are to meet our goal. So to do that, what we did is we created, to show you that, what we did is we created 3 scenarios, what we're called the low electricity scenario, the medium electricity scenario. That's actually the same blue decal version CAR proposed scenario that I was showing on the previous slides. And then the high electricity scenario. And the low one, basically where we have an option to use something that's not electricity, we sort of push the model more in that direction. So we tend to push more hydrogen, we tend to choose more hydrogen, more biofuels, more CCS, et cetera. And in the high case, where we have that same option, we try to push the model towards electricity. And the point of this is we want to sort of explore the bounds of possible futures of where the grid might look like and how much demand we might need in the decarbonized future to sort of get more of a range or some bounds on this problem. So the results are shown here in 2 plots. On the left, I'm showing what we call a load shape curve for our 3 scenarios, and then also the black one is where we sit in our model today, not necessarily exactly the same as where we are literally today, just in our model, which should be fairly similar to where we are today. But so anyways, what we're showing here is, and for each month of the year, what our electricity grid demand profile looks like on average for each month. So this is an average day in the month of January, an average day in the month of February, et cetera, for our 4 scenarios. And so overall, what we can see 2 things. One, starting from where we are today, depending on the scenario, we can see somewhere between a 20 to 70 gigawatt increase in peak load. So for example, from the black line here to the low electricity, either here or here, kind of hard to see where exactly the peak is in this case, but it's about a 20 gigawatt increase compared to the high scenario case where you end up increasing what looks like at about 70 gigawatts. So that is a massive peak load increase. And furthermore, we also tend to start shifting toward a winter peaking system as we start to electrify heating load in the building sector. So that is an enormous increase. And furthermore, we also notice, so in the electricity sector, we have to build for the worst case. We have to build for our peak capacity. So, but actually, we don't only see 20 to 70 gigawatts of increase in actual capacity additions, because we have to rely on solar and batteries and as well as some other sources, which are not able to output electricity completely consistently throughout the day. So what that means is, yes, we have a 20 to 70 gigawatt increase, but we actually have to build much more capacity than that. And in fact, what we're showing here on the right plot is the cumulative capacity that's been added over the modeling period in these 3 scenarios. So cumulatively over the entire, from 2020 to 2045. And we see the bounds of the capacity additions in the low electricity case is to 250 gigawatts, and in the high electricity case is 450. That's a big range, but sort of the takeaway is that that's a lot in either case. And sort of to put that into perspective, currently we're sitting at about 80 gigawatts of capacity in the state, and we've added about 30 gigawatts since the year 2000. So even in the best case, in the low electricity case, we're adding close to something like 8x or 9x capacity in the next 25 years compared to what we've added in the last 25 years, essentially. And to put this in perspective of land area, this ends up taking up somewhere between 0.5 and 2% of solar of California land just with solar panels. And that's just with some crude approximations. We can see also the distribution of what types of technologies are added. So the model chooses majority solar and batteries, but there is also a little bit of natural gas CCS, which ends up being very important, as I'll show on the next slide, as well as some wind power as well. Also, as we go into the next slide here, what I'm showing is what I'm calling the 99% CGC case. So this means that CGC stands for our clean generation constraint. So this is our emissions constraint on the grid. And what I'm saying here is that we're going to reach 99% clean by 2045. So for example, if we were to reach 100% clean by 2045, or maybe 95%, these cumulative capacity additions would be slightly different. And that's what I'm going to show actually on the next slide. So here I'm showing the same set of scenarios, except I'm also iterating over this clean generation constraint by 2045. So here on the y-axis, I'm showing the cumulative capacity that we've added. And on the x-axis, the clean generation constraint we used. The scenarios we just looked at is basically a slice of this analysis at the 99% level. So we also wanted to explore what is the impact of the clean generation constraint or this emissions constraint on capacity additions. We also want to look at what is the impact on the actual emissions in the grid. So here I'm just showing for these three cases how the electricity emissions changes as we change the clean generation constraint. And something that I thought was striking from this analysis is, first of all, you can see the exponential increase as we start to ramp closer and closer up to 100% CGC, or clean generation constraint. And in particular, moving from 99% to 100%, we see a very big increase. In many cases, we're almost doubling our capacity additions, not quite doubling, but close to it. And we see almost completely negligible impact in emissions. We're sitting somewhere at like 5 tons or maybe or less in these three cases. Now, we also see a lot of capacity, we see a big increase as well from 97.5% to 99%. But here, we're starting to get to emissions levels that are considerable. And if we pick 97.5, for example, this leftover emissions is ultimately going to have to come from somewhere else if we're talking about true zero. Maybe you could choose this, but then maybe you're going to need some more direct air capture, for example. But really, in particular, going from 99 to 100, we see very little benefit on the emission side and a lot of cost on the capacity addition side. So that we thought was interesting, and that's robust across all three scenarios. And something else I wanted to talk about is the reason why we see this exponential increase. So part of the reason why this is occurring is because as we ramp from 90% to 100%, the model can use less and less of natural gas with CCS, which is a clean baseload power source. But in the model, we model natural gas CCS, at least under default assumptions, as only 90% clean because it has a 90% capture rate. So as we approach this 100% level, the model can use less and less of this clean baseload power source and has to rely more so on solar and batteries and overbuilding those resources to fill the baseload hours during the nighttime when solar is not available. So to show that effect a little bit more, I'm just showing one more scenario here on the right. So here we have our same blue scenario. This is a 1-for-1, just our medium electricity case. And in this case, I'm just emphasizing that here we assume that natural gas CCS is 90% clean. Then I say, okay, what if in a hypothetical world, what if natural gas was 100% clean? What if this was a 100% clean baseload power source? What we see is that we actually completely avoid this overbuilding effect that we see at the very tippy end. And really, this assumption really only matters at levels above 95%. So even if we choose 95%, 90% natural gas CCS can avoid this overbuilding. So what this goes to show is this exponential increase is really because we're losing this clean baseload power source. And if we're able to get access to 100% clean baseload, whether that be natural gas CCS or some other technology that maybe doesn't exist, maybe nuclear or something like this, that could really help to mitigate overbuilding in the decarbonized future. Okay, I'm going to go to our next sector of the economy, and we'll talk about the transportation sector. So this is California's largest emitting sector. And what I'm trying to show in this analysis and in these series of experiments is that gradual progress towards ambitious sales goals or clean electric sales goals are a very effective strategy. So let me show you how we came to that conclusion. So here we're showing 4 scenarios. And what we're doing in these scenarios is we're changing the date in which we reach 100% clean, zero emission vehicle sales. So could be either battery or hydrogen. So in this, for example, we reach 100% clean sales by 2025, then 2035, 2045, and 2055. Worth mentioning that there's existing regulation in the light duty sector for, and I think also now the heavy duty sector as well, to reach zero emission vehicles by 2035. So this scenario here is most similar to the decal version car proposed scenario. What we want to know is, what if we, for example, overshoot our goal by 10 to 20 years? How much does that matter? And then also here I'm showing sort of a version of our CARB reference case as comparison. So we can, there's kind of a lot of different ways to interpret the results of this plot. Oh, whoopsies, that was an accident. One is you can actually see a very big difference between these 2 edge cases, right? And even between the 2035 and the 2055, that's about a 20 million ton difference or so, or maybe even more. Or we can see it more clearly here. Yeah, so that's about a 30 million ton difference or so. And that difference, so what that means is if we overshoot by 20 years, our goal, then that difference is going to have to come from somewhere else in the economy if we're true about zero, such as direct air capture or so. But you could also equivalently say that that just progress, even by overshooting by 20 years, we still make quite a bit of progress. And actually, I think it's a little bit easier to see the progress on the right plot. So on the left, we're showing economy-wide emissions, so the entire economy. On the right, we're just zooming into sort of the sectors that might be changing in this analysis, the electricity and hydrogen sectors, but most importantly, heavy-duty vehicles and light-duty vehicles, as well as the refining sector. So you can see the y-axis here a little bit different because we're just focusing in on the emissions that might change here. On the left, I'm showing our emissions today, or our version of today, across these sectors, and then in these 4 bars here, these 4 stacked bars, I'm showing the emissions in these scenarios that I showed here in 2045. So we can see kind of like similar results, but what's kind of striking is this 2055 scenario. We do see quite a bit of progress in the LDV and HDV sectors, respectively, here and here. You know, those emissions get cut by about half or more than half in those cases. So, you know, if we have this ambitious 2035 sales goal and we make gradual progress towards it, even if we overshoot, we're going to do a lot of good. That said, these emissions that are left over will still have to be made up in other places in the economy. And furthermore, at the very tippy end extreme, we can never quite get to absolute zero, even if we were to have this hypothetical case, which was, completely unrealistic. You know, 2025 is now next year. So even if we flipped a switch and could change all the sales to 100% clean by next year, we still wouldn't reach absolute zero in these subsectors. So that means that there's going to be some amount of direct air capture that's needed to make up for these stock and flow lag effects. The question is how much. So there really is a lot of ways to interpret these results. You could view them positively and say, hey, we could overshoot our goal and make a lot of progress still. But you could also say, yeah, but we're going to need some amount of direct air capture no matter what. And I think the overall takeaway, though, should be that we need these ambitious targets and we have to move towards them. And the faster we can get to them, the better, I guess. We also can see, like, maybe there is a bit of diminishing returns, like going from 2035 to 2025 doesn't help that much. And that's because these survival distributions for these technologies, basically how long they're in the stock for. They're long-tailed, essentially. So there's going to be a very small fraction of cars that exist on the road for a very long time. So that's why we see sort of diminishing returns here. One more slide on the transportation sector before we get to the next sector. Here, so on the last slide, I was iterating on the rate of change. Here, I'm iterating on something, a type of lever we call technology choice. Basically, like where presented with a choice in the model, which choice should we pick? So here I'm showing 4 scenarios. So the rates across these scenarios, how fast we move, are all constant. The only thing I'm changing is which technology we pick. So here I'm showing 100% BEV for HDVs and 100% fuel cell electric vehicles for HDVs, and then the same too for LDVs. And on the left here, I'm showing the abatement costs in units of dollars per ton. We can see is for both LDVs and HDVs, battery electric vehicles are more cost effective than fuel cell vehicles. Again, I wouldn't take away the outright number from this plot, because that's fairly uncertain, but I think the relative comparison between the two technology types is something we feel a little bit more confident about. And so what we can see, and sort of like one takeaway from this plot, is that BEVs are quite effective. We also see, interestingly, that in general, heavy-duty vehicles are, by and large, a cheaper problem, at least by this abatement cost metric, than LDVs. There's a lot of reasons for that. One has to do with the fact that we're of this total resource cost test. So, we're not taking into account like maybe charge time effects that might impair people who use these heavy-duty battery electric vehicles. Another reason is sort of these heavy-duty vehicles, you get more bang for your buck. So if you decarbonize one truck, that accounts for more emissions than an equivalent light-duty vehicle. So I think that's probably the biggest reason. On the right, what we're showing is sort of to show a little bit more intuition of like where the costs are and what the big cost drivers are in this analysis. So I'm showing the same 4 set of scenarios, but I'm breaking down the numerator, dollars. So this is the x-axis here is marginal spending in units of net present value in units of billions of US dollars. So this is basically how much money we spent accounting for inflation and discounting over the modeling period in various subcategories. And you can see that in the legend here. And the point of this is to show what the cost drivers are of these technologies. We can see in the fuel cell cases, big cost drivers are refueling stations and distribution and storage of hydrogen. And this comes from sort of the latest and greatest models from NRail. And refueling stations and distribution and storage is by far the biggest driver of cost and in high hydrogen transportation scenarios. We also see that in the case of the fuel cell cases, the actual cost of the vehicle themselves can be a cost driver. So in the BEV cases, actually, you can get sometimes that these transportation block or the cost of the vehicle themselves can sometimes be negative. And that's because NRail projects cost parity and then actually cost decline of these alternative transportation devices in the next 10 to 15 years. In the case of LDV FCEVs, we see that there's those are much more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative. In the case of electricity, like high electricity scenarios, the cost of electricity transmission and distribution is one of the biggest drivers. And in all 4 scenarios, actually, there's considerable resource savings and in-state incentives that drive some negative costs. So that just puts a little bit more intuition. Also, it's important to say what's not a cost driver in these cases, and in both sort of like equivalently, electricity generation in these cases and hydrogen generation in these cases are not huge drivers. It's really the transmission and distribution of these fuels. And also BEV chargers seem to be less expensive overall than equivalent refueling stations. Okay. let's switch gears and talk about the industrial sector. So here, the point of this slide is to try to show you that CCS is a fairly effective option across many industrial subsectors. And here what I'm doing is pretty similar analysis to the one I just showed, where we're just iterating on choice where there's a choice available. On the left, I'm showing how much emissions each of these technologies is responsible for abating for in 2045. And on the right, I'm showing the abatement costs of these different technologies or different scenarios. And we're breaking down by subsector. So we have cement, refining, and upstream oil and gas, small manufacturing plants, and large manufacturing plants. So stepping back, sort of the big takeaway is, we want these bars to be big. So we want large abatement opportunity. And we want these bars to be small. We want low cost. And what we can see is that by and large, the CCS bars are fairly big on this side, maybe not the biggest. And there are different reasons for that I can get into. But definitely by and large, they have the smallest cost. And that's mainly driven by incentives such as 45Q and LCFS. Also worth mentioning that in decal, at least, there are some industrial subsectors where electrification of some kind, electric resistance, heat pump, and hydrogen, is not available at all. So, that makes CCS inherently important for those subsectors. And in the interest of time, I'm not sure I'm going to get into explaining, why this bar is less than this bar, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe in question period, we can get into that if interested. But sort of the large takeaway is that CCS does a relatively good job at abatement and a very good job in cost compared to these other options, such as electric resistance, heat pump, and hydrogen. Okay, next we'll talk about sort of the refrigerant subsector or F-gases. So for those that don't know, F-gases are used in air conditioners predominantly today, but are also used in heat pumps, which pretend to be an important decarbonization option in the building sector and in the decarbonized future. And refrigerant leaks can occur either during annual operation, just like small, tiny leaks throughout the day, and also in particular in the residential sector and for small commercial buildings. CARB believes there is a high end-of-life leak rate for some building types and some technology types, where technicians potentially are just venting these F-gases to atmosphere rather than collecting them and recycling them. So there's sort of two ways that refrigerants can get leaked to the atmosphere. And these refrigerants have a very high global warming potential. Oftentimes, they are 2,000 more times potent for warming compared to CO2. So that's just a little bit of background of what F-gases are. And you can see that in these scenarios that I'm showing, F-gases are already currently an important portion of emissions today. And you'll see sort of broadly in the literature that this is sort of one of these hard to decarbonize areas. In one of our very first plots, we had labeled this as an R&D area, something that there's not a lot of scalable solutions for currently. But here what I'm showing is 4 scenarios. I have a scenario where we do nothing with F-gases at all. So we just, sort of let it ride. And, we install heat pumps and do nothing about F-gases. In this scenario here, I'm saying, okay, what if we reduce those end-of-life leak rates? So basically, that would imply installing some sort of responsible end-of-life management program where we make sure that technicians are handling these refrigerants responsibly. Then in this scenario here, this is what we do in the decal version CARB proposed scenario. Essentially, CARB assumes around an 85% reduction in the global warming potential of refrigerants by roughly 2050 or maybe 2052. And they assume this because of a program that's in place that sort of mandates that reduction. Now, they sort of admit that the technologies to meet that reduction are not yet in place, but they go ahead and assume that because the policy mandates it. So it's a little bit of a question mark of how we can actually do this. And then this light blue scenario here is where we're doing both. We do both end-of-life leak rates, and we reduce both end-of-life leak rates and the annual leak rate, or the annual global warming potential. So what we can see from this is that if we do nothing, we expect our F-gas emissions to increase by about 5 million tons. And that's because of heat pumps that we're installing into the economy. If we just focus on leak rates, which seems like a more approachable sort of ready-made strategy, we can keep our F-gas emissions relatively constant despite installing a bunch of heat pumps. But really, if we want deep reductions in this subsector, we are going to need access to these low global warming potential refrigerants, which are currently not at scale and costly by and large. Some good candidates are carbon dioxide itself would obviously be excellent, and also propane. There is some hope. There are some water heat pumps that residents can buy with that use CO2 as a refrigerant. Actually, Lynn Orr, who's on the call, owns one of these guys. So, it is possible, but, this is definitely something we need to focus our attention on. So again, any leftover emissions that we have at the end is otherwise just going to have to be taken care of by direct air capture or some other carbon dioxide removal method.
Josh, in the sake of time, I'm going to suggest you actually move on to direct air capture.
Okay. And how much time do we have left there?
We are at 12:50.
So, and when do we end?
1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So here I was showing in the building sector, similar effects as the transport. I was showing the importance of stock and flow and how we need to reach our sales goals quickly. And yeah, in the interest of time, we'll probably get to, I think, the most important analysis we have left, which is direct air capture. So here, we're looking at this assumption that CARB has, which is the 65 million or 64 million tons of direct air capture by 2045. In our model, it's about 67 or 66 or so. But by and large, CARB is highly reliant on DAC. And what we want to know is, how can we reduce this number? Also worth mentioning that CARB uses about 9 million tons of bioenergy with carbon dioxide removal, or otherwise known as BECCS. And so what we did is we created a minimal DAC scenario. So basically, in order to reduce that number, we have to push other places in the economy a little bit further so that we can get to zero while also reducing that 66 million ton number. So I'm not going to go through all the assumptions here, but basically what we're doing is throughout the economy, we're taking what were already quite aggressive assumptions in the decal version CARB proposed scenario and incrementing them and pushing them even further in the minimal DAC scenario to see how far that gets us and how much less DAC can we use. And so the results are here of the minimal DAC scenario. And actually, the results are at the bottom here. So what we can see is on the left side, we use 67 million tons of DAC and 8 million tons of BECCS. In the right side, we're using 15 million tons of DAC and 31 million tons of BECCS. So, quite a bit of reduction, quite a bit of improvement. But I think actually the big takeaway here is that 15 million tons is still a lot. I think the IEA projects 9 million or maybe 3 million tons by 2035 or something like that. I'd have to check. I'd have to get the exact source, but that's globally. So here we're saying 15 million tons as a minimum in California alone. And furthermore, getting to that 15 million tons required pushing the rest of the economy into a really extreme state. So I think the takeaway from this, and by the way, including using 31 million tons of BECCS, which may or may not be feasible, which I can get into. But the takeaway here is that even with beyond extreme decarbonization assumptions, we're going to need quite a bit of direct air capture. So this is probably a technology that we're going to need at scale if we're going to reach our net zero target. So yeah, in the interest of time, we had to skip a couple analyses today. I apologize for that. But here on this slide, I'm showing sort of our answer to the question of what's it going to take We talked about the broad range of technologies that will be needed across the economy, how we really need capacity expansion in the grid, the effects of going from 99 to 100%, and maybe really 99 is really only needed. We need these ambitious sales targets in the transportation and building sector and more gradual progress toward them. CCS is quite economically effective. We also see we really need these low GWP refrigerants, and we also will need direct air capture. I've also summarized here some R&D focus areas and policy implications. I'll just breeze through these in the interest of time, not getting into too much detail. So R&D focus area, it's a bit repetitive: direct air capture, F-gases, batteries. We didn't quite talk about biofuel feedstocks today. We did see that hydrogen distribution and storage is quite expensive. And policy implications, we really need sales targets in the building sector. We recommend possibly a 99% CGC. And I think this is probably the biggest takeaway from the study, is that all of these things we talked about today implies massive infrastructure building and massive movements in the economy. And we cannot let permitting be sort of, and red tape sort of be an issue. Like, we have to be all hands on deck. We have to be building these things very quickly, and we have to be very efficient at doing so. So we need to really streamline that process. Here, I'm just talking about some additional possible use cases for the model that we built. I won't get into details here, but the point is that there are other questions we have that the same tool that we built could be used for. And yeah, so I just want to conclude by thanking our sponsors listed here on the screen, and open it up for questions. Also, I did want to also direct attention to the link. This has our white paper, as Sarah mentioned, which will be updated in the next few weeks and months. And if you're curious about the couple analyses that we skipped today, you can read about them in the white paper. Cool.
Great. Okay. At this point, we'd like to open it up for questions. So Zoom seems to have a new feature. You can't just unmute yourself, but if you click on the raise hand button down at the bottom of your screen, then I will see something pop up on the right, and I can actually then unmute you, but I can't do that until I see that you have raised your hand. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and then I will unmute you. I do see in the, it's also possible to type in a Q&A. I see Cody suggested that for the minimal DAC scenario, it would be useful to see in the table highlighted where the differences are. That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, so we actually, Cody, I didn't have a ton of time to talk about it, but we have a plot here that shows in 2045 what the emissions are in various subsectors that are sort of left over. And you can see the gradual progress that's being made in each subsector. And the biggest difference is the increase in BECCS. I think the takeaway here is that the very tippy end of the decarbonization profile is a combination of sort of the sum of small emission sources throughout the economy. And in particular, the non-energy, there's like sort of two main sources: non-energy sources, such as refrigerants and things like, and enteric fermentation that are hard to decarbonize. And then also like leftover from stock and flow effects. Those are two major sources. But yeah, you can see this paper in our white paper, and also there's a table associated with it as well that'll be out.
Great. Okay. I see we have a question from Elise Lepine.
Hi, thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I was just wondering, for the minimal DAC scenario, if you have an assessment of what the changes in cost would be for reaching the same goal under the different profile.
That's a good question. We could look at that. I don't think we did. I think the point was the reason we didn't is we were kind of wondering about this, how low could we go? But yeah, that would be interesting to look at the difference in cost. I'd expect the cost probably to come down because we're using less DAC, and DAC is one of the most expensive measures. But maybe another reason we didn't look at the cost is because one of the biggest drivers is this bioenergy with CCS assumption. And using this much bioenergy with CCS implies that we have these bioenergy resources available. And as I get into in the paper, like, that's going to be tricky. That's also like we're bumping up now against a feedstock constraint.
Mhm.
So I would expect probably the outright cost to be lower, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better because we might start bumping into other constraints, like such as the availability of these feedstocks.
Okay, that's great context. Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Any other questions? Again, just touch the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen and you will light up and I can then allow you to ask your question live.
I see some comments from Randall about sort of the difficulty and complexity of injecting CO2 into the ground, both for CCS and for direct air capture. And I think the answer to that is yes. I don't have all the details about that. Like I'm sort of operating at an economy-wide level. I do know that by and large, the amount of CCS and DAC that we're assuming in this study, we have like enough storage for that. But just because we have enough storage doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Like it's still a lot of work and there's a lot of research that needs to be done. But, I think sort of that would be the focus of another study saying, basically output of our study is here's how much CCS and DAC we might need. Another study might be like how are we going to do this? What are the implications? That was a little bit out of scope for us.
Great. Okay. Michael, if you could unmute, I think you had a question. Michael Marks. Oh, maybe I can't. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, that was just an error. Go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. Did anyone else have a question anymore?
I see a question in the chat from Wei Chen about the role of nuclear power. So I mean, I have one backup slide about nuclear power. If I can get to it quickly, let me exit out of here. I don't know if I have time to explain the whole analysis we did, but we did take a look at it. Essentially, what we're doing here is we took out from this line to this line, we took out Diablo Canyon. We can see like a pretty minimal impact on overall cumulative abated emission, overall cumulative capacity added. But this analysis sort of bakes in that we would never add more nuclear power. So maybe your question is asking, what if we could add more nuclear power? That we didn't quite take a look at. We just said, what is the effect of removing Diablo, which we thought was overall, by and large minimal. But, if we could actually add nuclear power, that could be a big impact because as you're maybe alluding to, this 100%, this like all clean dispatchable power source could be nuclear. That could be an interesting solution. Yeah. And then direct ocean capture, I'm not sure what that refers to. Is that like
Another carbon removal technology, and we did not specifically look at that in this study.
Yeah, we didn't look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll conclude at this point. We have recorded this webinar. We will put it out on our website. Again, we have a brief out on our website that you're welcome to download. And we will be updating the white paper that we've got out there with some of our more recent cost estimates as well. So stay tuned. And thank you for participating today.
Thank you, everyone.